On February 24, 2022, the Russian special military operation in Ukraine began. This event transformed global geopolitics and marked a turning point in international relations, triggering a series of profound and lasting consequences that redefined the international balance of power. In Ukraine, an irreversible process has begun, the outcome of which is inevitable: the unequivocal defeat of the country at the hands of the Russian Federation. This defeat has its roots in the events of 2022, and the current scenario in 2025 can only be understood through a detailed analysis of the decisive moments of the conflict that have brought us to this point. In 2025, the United States and the Russian Federation sat down at the negotiating table to define a new global geopolitical order, making it clear who holds the true power on the international stage. Ukraine's defeat was practically guaranteed 3 years ago, and we can assert that the country had already lost the war from the very beginning of the conflict on February 24, 2022, when Vladimir Putin ordered Russian troops to cross the border and invade Ukraine. The Ukrainian army began to crumble rapidly. By the first week of March 2022, the atmosphere was one of defeat. During peace negotiations in Turkey in March of that year, the Russian Federation presented an agreement that demanded few concessions from Ukraine: recognition of the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which were already considered independent republics, and acknowledgement of the legal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. Ukraine had to accept permanent neutrality and abandon any intention of joining NATO to ensure a peace process. With conditions, a definitive agreement was nearly signed, which would have prevented 3 years of war. However, in a surprising turn of events, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson delivered a message to Kyiv, encouraging resistance and promising NATO's support for the country in the conflict. This initiated a steady flow of military aid to Ukraine, including Javelin missile systems, Stinger manpads, Bayraktar drones, tanks, Soviet-era armored vehicles, military advisors, artillery, and a multitude of weapons that continued to be supplied over the following 3 years. Many of these equipment pieces are now on display at Patriot Park in Moscow. It is worth noting that NATO's military aid did not begin in March 2022, but had already started as early as 2014. NATO had been training and arming Ukrainians during this period, and 8 years of preparation would not be wasted in just 2 weeks. They decided, therefore, to invest everything in rearming the Ukrainian army. By the end of 2022, they planned to expel Russian troops with a re-equipped Ukrainian army, laying the groundwork for a counteroffensive. The goal was to destabilize Russian forces, drawing the Russian Federation into a war of attrition against the entirety of NATO. Meanwhile, Kyiv and European states pretended to be willing to sign a peace agreement with Russia in exchange for guarantees that Russian troops would withdraw from Kyiv and Chernihiv. However, this ultimately proved to be a deceptive strategy, as once the Russians withdrew, the peace agreement was abandoned, and Kyiv declared this as its first military victory in the war since the beginning of Vladimir Putin's actions. Since then, Vladimir Putin has vowed never to negotiate with European states or Zelensky again. As of February 2025, this promise remains steadfast. Now, Europe and Zelensky are demanding a seat at the negotiating table from which they were excluded. What followed is well known. NATO poured its arsenals into Ukraine, launching massive offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv, turning the war of maneuver into a war of attrition. Quickly, Russian forces withdrew, understanding NATO's strategy, and initiated a war of attrition themselves. By the end of 2022, Ukraine had regained parts of Kherson and Kharkiv, but lost a significant portion of its armies in the process. Meanwhile, Russia began a campaign of massive bombings, leading to a major escalation of the conflict. Since then, talk of peace has ceased. Ukraine focused on expelling Russian forces from its territory, while Russia prepared for a prolonged war, with neither side willing to back down. 2023 marked the first year of true attrition, with decisive battles such as those in Soledar and Bakhmut, where the Wagner Group played a prominent role. Cities in Donbass were liberated one after another, and Ukraine lost many of its troops in these battles. For the first time, doubts emerged within NATO about the possibility of defeating Russia in a war of attrition. If the first half of 2023 raised doubts for NATO, the second half of the year was marked by the famous Zaporizhzhia offensive. This operation featured cutting-edge equipment, such as Leopard 2 tanks, M1 Abrams armored vehicles, Challenger vehicles, CB-90S, mortars, and other weapon systems that, in theory, were supposed to push the Russians out of Ukraine. However, the Zaporizhzhia offensive failed to even breach the first line of Russian defense, known as the Surovikin Line, and cost Ukraine another army, with approximately 90,000 Ukrainians killed. NATO realized that defeating Russia would not be so easy. By the end of 2023, it became clear that the Russian army would not be destroyed in Ukraine and that the country would not collapse easily. The economic sanctions imposed since the start of the war did not weaken Russia. On the contrary, its economy and industry demonstrated resilience. In Zaporizhzhia, it became evident that the war of attrition initiated by NATO against Russia in 2022 did not harm Russia, but rather NATO itself. Russia rapidly and efficiently increased its weapons production, and by the end of 2023, NATO's doubts turned into fear. It became clear that there was no quick way to defeat the Russians, at least not in the way they were attempting. Militarily, 2024 was a year of uncertainties and hardships for Ukraine, where every strategy was attempted but without success. The loss of Avdiivka and other strategic points in Donbass, combined with a series of painful defeats and an unrelenting war of attrition waged by Russia, made it clear that Ukraine and NATO were now in the position of victims. Many began to believe that the war against Russia could not be. The Kursk offensive was Ukraine's last attempt to change the course of the conflict, but it turned into a bloody stalemate. Meanwhile, Russian forces advanced increasingly faster in Donbass, putting Kyiv back in the crosshairs. The worst part was that NATO could no longer increase its support, having exhausted its resources the previous year. With its arsenals nearly empty, Ukraine had to make do with the monthly production of Western arms industries. NATO's final desperate move was an escalation: the delivery of long-range weapons to Kyiv, such as ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadows, which struck Russian soil. However, even this measure was not enough to alter the course of the war. Russia's response was firm and direct, putting an end to NATO expansionist ambitions, as the only escalation that followed was the nuclear threat. It became evident that Ukraine could not win either the war of attrition or the war of movement. Ukraine's attempts at escalation resulted in catastrophic mistakes, hastening its defeat. With the arrival of Donald Trump in 2025, a dose of rationality was finally introduced into a strategy that had never made sense. The obvious was admitted: Ukraine, on its own, could not win the war. After 3 years of joint efforts between Ukraine, the United States, and about 50 other nations, including NATO members, it was not possible to defeat Russia militarily, nor would there be any chance of doing so in the future. Trying to prolong the war was simply unwise. U.S. President Donald Trump acknowledged that Ukraine had lost 700,000 soldiers in combat, not counting the wounded. Additionally, NATO's arsenals were depleted, while Russia, far from weakening, seemed to grow stronger every day. While Ukraine had to permanently give up its aspirations to join NATO and reduce its military, 3 years of conflict passed. However, by 2025, Ukraine will have to relinquish not only Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, and Zaporizhzhia, but also regions such as Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, Dnipro, Petrov, and Odessa to definitively end the war. Additionally, Ukraine will have to completely sever any ties with NATO and reduce its armed forces, as its security will depend on other countries. If that were not enough, Ukraine now not only has to meet the demands of the Russian Federation, but also faces a demand from Donald Trump, representing the United States, which insists on the repayment of $500 billion, equivalent to the American investment in Ukraine since 2014. It is evident that, after 3 years of conflict, Vladimir Putin and Russia will emerge with far more than what was initially proposed in 2022. Russia's victory extends well beyond Ukraine's borders. Meanwhile, the United States proposes a withdrawal from Europe, leaving NATO in a fragile position. European arsenals are at historically low levels, while Russia's military industry and its army have been significantly strengthened. Many things changed over those 3 years, and the terms for achieving peace also shifted. It is worth remembering that, in March 2022, Russia had only demanded recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in Crimea as part of its territory. Although the final conditions that will determine the end of this conflict remain shrouded in uncertainty, one conclusion is undeniable. Ukraine is already in a position of defeat, while Russia has secured a much more comprehensive, decisive victory with significantly more advantageous terms than those that could have been achieved in March 2022 during the peace negotiation attempts. NATO's own strategy, which bet on the possibility of defeating Russia through military support and economic pressure, proved to be a miscalculation. Believing they could weaken Russia and force it to concede, NATO's efforts ultimately proved ineffective. Now, it is evident that the victory they sought was never attainable, and Russia emerges from the conflict in a strengthened position, both militarily and geopolitically.